There have been few standard metagames in the history of Magic the Gathering as universally reviled as Ikoria and M21, and there were many factors involved in that, some of them more environmental than experiential, but even if you're one of the few like me who thought this standard received some hyperbolically harsh criticism, it's still hard to deny there weren't plenty of oppressive forces in the format. Most of us had resigned ourselves to another 6 weeks of Temur and Teferi, and others even decided to abandon Standard completely until the fall rotation. But then, it happened. On Monday morning, Wizards decided to give us all an early Christmas present in the form of a Standard shakeup that many of us wished for, but never believed would actually happen. Teferi Time Raveler, Wilderness Reclamation, Growth Spiral, and Cauldron Familiar were all banned from the format in one stroke, and so far, the response to this has been largely celebratory, but after the party, we're left with the question of what to do now. So today, we're going to talk about what decks are in, what decks are out, and what to expect in what will be a short-lived but exciting Standard. In order to discern the future, one must first know the past, so let's start by quickly looking at each card that was banned so we can analyze what individual effects their exits might have on the format. First of all, with no Wilderness Rec, the Rec deck is wrecked, so we know straight away that a deck with as much as a 60% share of the tournament meta is now completely erased. The Cat is also lost, and it's not coming back anytime soon, so the Sacrifice decks that have competed in the meta for so long have lost a vital piece of their engine that allowed them to get multiple Mayhem Devil triggers per turn. That said, Claim the Firstborn, Priest of Forgotten Gods, Mayhem Devil, they're still good Magic cards, so I wouldn't count these Sacrifice decks out just yet. Growth Spiral is also leaving the format, and its absence will severely impact ramp decks that play Euro. The Simic Titan will still be an important and highly played card, but the loss of an instant speed effect that ramps on turn 2, draws a card, and puts a card in the graveyard to fuel escape changes the play patterns of decks attempting to optimize Euro. One could argue that Euro allowed ramp decks to effectively play 8 copies of Growth Spiral, so cutting that number by 50% will drastically affect the consistency of ramp decks and leave them with suboptimal turn 2 plays, at least when compared to Growth Spiral. Paradise Druid might be a good Magic card, but it doesn't draw a card and it can be wrathed. It's possible that ramp decks that race to Ugin can still exist thanks to Euro and Cultivate, but now they have to play a little more fair. They still have Nissa and Hydroid Krasis for the next few weeks though, so ramp isn't down for the count yet either. But now, the star of the show, Teferi is out, and that means a lot of things. Instants and spells with flash are immediately more playable, counter spells will never be dead in your hand, and the mid-sized creature or enchantment that you built your deck around has a better chance of staying on the board. Elspeth Conquers Death is slightly powered down without a planeswalker to bounce it back to your hand for a fresh casting, and there's also the argument that Bant is dead after losing 2 of its key cards, which should mean that both ECD and Shatter the Sky will see less play as a result. In its entirety, all of this information signals 3 things that indicate a return to the traditional paper, rock, scissors paradigm of MTG standard formats. 1. Aggro is more playable with no Teferi to bounce your creatures, no Growth Spiral to get the ramp deck to a sweeper on turn 3, and far fewer Sacrifice decks playing Claim the Firstborn, all of which were major hindrances to aggro. 2. Mid-range decks get better with no Teferi to bounce your key permanents, fewer ramp decks to jump ahead of you on the curve, and fewer Sacrifice to priest your creatures and outvalue you in the late game. 3. Control is more playable thanks to instant speed cards being far more viable in a format without Teferi. To a lesser extent, it could also be argued that control decks get better without Sacrifice decks creating cheap, repeatable value that's difficult to interact with. But mostly it's the fact that Teferi is gone, so counterspells and cheap instant speed answers and card draw all get an upgrade. Looking at aggro decks first, there are players who are excited to sleeve up decks like Blue-White Flyers and White Weenies again, but the aggro deck that gets the biggest boost from this announcement is an old nemesis, the Red Menace. Embercleave is an even better card now that the flash ability is guaranteed to be relevant, and you should expect it to be everywhere, not only in the mono-red aggro deck, but also in the Gruul Creatures deck that feels a little more mid-rangey. Overall, there are many reasons why aggro decks get better, and not all of them are based around Embercleave's reemergence. Ramp and control decks won't be able to get to that turn 3 sweeper as often without Growth Spiral, meaning that turn 4 wins on the play are far more probable. Teferi won't bounce your Anax or reset the counters on Runaway Steamkin, and not having to attack a Planeswalker on turn 3 means not having to decide between killing Teferi and casting Light Up the Stage that turn. One of the largest upgrades to aggro has nothing to do with Teferi though, and that's the kneecapping of sacrifice decks. We don't talk enough about how suffocating the presence of Claim the Firstborn is to aggro decks, and with theoretically fewer of them in the format, aggro should be safer and less frustrating to play in general. But I remain confident that Mono Red will remain king of the aggro decks despite what other aggro decks might exist, like the Rotting Registrar Demonic Embrace deck, which will likely hang on to the bronze title in terms of aggro decks in the standard, because I think there's another big winner in the aggro category: mono green aggro. Stompy has already produced some pretty respectable results in this meta, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. The green deck lost nothing in the ban announcement and very likely benefits from Growth Spiral's exit in the same way that the aggro decks do. There are arguments that Stonecurl Serpent won't be as powerful without Teferi to stomp on, and it could be said that Questing Beast gets marginally worse for the same reason, but I don't think these are very convincing arguments and that I don't think they represent particularly big blows to Stompy's game. Big Green will still dominate the early and mid game, but I don't like its in-game and top deck scenarios as much as some of the other decks we'll talk about today. That said, cards like Pelt Collector and Turn 2 Barkhide Troll on the draw seem like much safer plays without Teferi lying in wait to bounce them for value. Both Mono Green Stompy and Gruul Aggro have traditionally been able to go over the top of aggro decks like Mono Red while still playing a fast enough game plan to go underneath control and combo decks, which leaves them in a good position for the next few weeks. The only other aggro deck I think is truly worth taking a look at is Mardu Winota, a fairly new deck which also lost nothing and benefits greatly from a format less hostile to aggro and mid-range hybrid decks. This deck can feel unbeatable at times and very clunky at others, so it's hard to analyze just how serious the deck was before the bans, much less now, but I still wanted to bring this deck up because Winota is undeniably one of the strongest cards in Standard, and we would do well to remember she exists. On to mid-range, where there's a lot of excitement but not much certainty. The only deck that qualifies as mid-range that we can be absolutely sure will get a massive boost in play is Temur Adventures, mostly as the result of the overall drop in power level in the format. Until recently, we didn't see too many synergy-driven decks in the format aside from the sacrifice decks, and there are many reasons for that, but in the case of Temur Adventures, the main reason was that a turn 2 Lucky Clover feels terrible when your opponent untaps, plays Teferi, bounces your Clover, and draws a card. It also felt bad to play Clover only to have your opponent play Growth Spiral at the end of your turn, draw a card, and jump ahead of you on the curve. Those things won't happen anymore, and on top of that, now you can play Brazen Borrower or Bonecrusher Giant Spell Half whenever you want, rather than having to wait until your turn, and that increases their stock by a lot. Speaking of Brazen Borrower, by the way, it's in an interesting place right now because it's instantly more playable thanks to Teferi's exit, and it's also a replacement for Teferi in some ways. I've already spoken a lot about how this or that permanent is safer to play because it won't get bounced, but that isn't necessarily true when Brazen Borrower is seeing a large share of the meta. It costs mana to use this bounce ability, and it doesn't draw a card or stop interaction, so it's far from Teferi, but we would be wise to remember that Borrower is a force in Standard when brewing new decks. Altogether, Temur Adventures has a wide variety of options for the endgame, from flinging a Beanstalk Giant to wishing for an Ugin or a Mass Manipulation, and it has a large variety of play patterns thanks to its ability to generate card advantage while still playing threats to the board. It's a versatile deck with a lot of powerful cards, and I fully expect it to show up. Another mid-range deck that may see some new life is the Doom Foretold deck. Whether it's the Hero of Precinct 1 build or the more control-centric list, Doom Foretold is a deck that a dedicated portion of the fan base is always interested in making real, but any theories about this deck's ability to thrive in this format are for now pure speculation. Losing Teferi actually hurts this list in some ways, as Teferi was one of its key 3-drops, but that may not be as impactful as we think. It still has to find another turn 3 play that affects the board and can be sacrificed to Doom Foretold, but there are plenty of options for them to fill that slot. It's possible this deck gets better the fewer ramp decks there are, so Growth Spiral's ban might also help the list. I also think it's possible to argue that with Temur Reclamation gone, Dance of the Manse might be the best in-game combo kill in Standard, but you'd have to have some real data on your hands to get me to buy into that argument, and we just don't have that yet. That's the problem with analyzing mid-range in this format. The meta is undeniably more open to it, but we have no past results to go by for cards like Rhythm of the Wild or Terror of the Peaks, so it's hard to say they'll make it to the top of the format in Week 1. Finally, to Control, which is one of the most interesting cases in terms of theory crafting. The Azorius Yorion deck has gotten some press in the last few days, but I'm wary to play Azorius without Teferi. Counterspells in general got better, so you could drop Neutralize into the 3-drop slot and call it a day, especially with cards like Shatter the Sky, Elspeth Conquers Death, and Yorion as haymakers and playmakers, but I think the better option for Control is either Dimir or Sultai, in large part due to Thought Erasure. It's possible this card is playable again, although turn 2 Erasure on the draw against mono red isn't usually great, but it feels great against a lot of other decks, especially other control decks, mid-range decks looking to play key permanents, and synergy-driven or combo decks that have pieces critical to their game plan, and those are all archetypes that are expected to see more play, so Thought Erasure is well positioned. Not every control deck will opt to play Erasure, as Simic and Dimir Flash will both attempt to make a run at the title of best control deck, but personally, I like Sultai Control the most. This deck gets to play everything from counterspells to early removal to sweepers, along with cards like Euro, Nissa, and Hydroid Krasis. We could even see a hybrid control ramp deck similar to Bant that slow rolls into an Ugin in the late game. Sultai has the tools to disrupt opposing game plans, remove threats, and play terrifying threats of its own, so it wouldn't surprise me if Sultai was universally recognized as the best deck in the format in 2 weeks. There's even talk of a Sultai discontinuity deck that's similar to the Nexus of Fate deck from last year's standard, but that's all myth for now. What we know for sure is that Sultai has a lot of both threats and answers, and that's a formula for success. That's all the analysis we can do for now, but that isn't to say there's not a very real chance that some unheard of dark horse could appear and take over standard. Only time will tell, so let me know what decks and cards you think have a shot at the title in the comments section below. You can also find deck lists for the decks that we've talked about in this video in the description, and if you can, hit the like button and sub to the channel for more content like this. You can also watch me play Magic on Twitch at SBMTGDev, follow me on Twitter at the same name, and support us by going to patreon.com/SBMTG and giving $1 a month to vote on what content we do around here. As always, I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.